Good morning, friends. The sunlight outside my window is soft and gold, slipping through the curtains like it has nowhere else to be. The kettle is humming on the stove, and for a moment, the world feels gentle, unhurried. Maybe you're starting your day with coffee, maybe you're stretching under the covers, wishing for 5 more minutes of rest. Either way, I'm grateful you're here. Here's a hard truth to hold with your morning cup. You might not survive if you think family always shows up when you need them most. Sometimes the ones you love are the ones who vanish when the chair beside you is suddenly empty. So before we go further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I share here. And in the comments, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Now dim the lights if you want to let a fan hum for background comfort and come with me into this story. Edward Bennett. My husband of 43 years died on a cold Monday morning. Hospitals are strange places for endings: fluorescent light, the hum of machines, the polite efficiency of nurses who've seen this story too many times. His hand went slack in mine, and that was it. The funeral came swiftly, a blur of flowers and formalities. Neighbors brought casseroles, friends clasped my hands too long, and the pastor spoke of eternity as though it could soften the weight of the empty seat beside me. But eternity, I learned, doesn't fold the laundry or silence the creak of floorboards at midnight. My son Michael attended, of course. He stood tall and somber, but his eyes shifted too often toward his wife Caroline. She dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief and whispered consolations that felt scripted. At the graveside, while dirt struck the casket like muted thunder, I caught the faintest gleam in her expression. Not sorrow, but calculation. By the time mourners drifted home, Michael and Caroline were already discussing travel plans. "It'll be good to get away," Caroline said brightly. "Help us reset after all this heaviness." All this heaviness, as though grief were an inconvenience to be shaken off with a week by the coast. Odd fact of the day: in Victorian England, widows were expected to wear black for 2 years. I don't envy the rule, but I understand the instinct. Grief doesn't leave on schedule. It lingers, seeps into the walls, makes every cup of tea taste different. That first night alone in the house, I wandered from room to room, touching Edward's glasses, his old chair, the dent in the pillow he wouldn't need again. The silence was so vast, it felt like another presence. Caroline's voice, though, still rang in my ears. Reset. For her, perhaps. For me, the story was only beginning. Later in my journal, I wrote, "If casseroles could cure grief, I'd be immortal. If absence were a sound, it would creak in floorboards." And me, I'm still here, learning how to breathe in the aftermath. I closed the book, slid it under my pillow, and let the house settle around me like an old quilt, heavy but mine. The morning after the funeral, I woke to the clatter of dishes in my own kitchen. For a moment, I thought Edward was making his usual oatmeal, humming off key to the radio. But when I shuffled down the hallway, I found Caroline at the stove, her manicured hands clumsy with the frying pan. "Oh, Elaine." She caught herself flustered. "Claudia, you needn't worry. I told Michael I'd come early to help you." Her words were wrapped in silk, but the undertone was steel. She wasn't asking permission, she was taking territory. Michael sat at the table, scrolling on his phone, not meeting my eyes. He muttered, "She's just trying to help Mom." I watched as Caroline rearranged my cupboard, stacking mugs in the wrong places, sliding spice jars into unfamiliar rows. Every clink was a reminder this was no longer my kitchen, but a stage she was eager to redesign. Odd fact of the day: anthropologists say kitchens are the heart of a home. By that measure, Caroline wasn't tidying, she was performing open heart surgery without consent. When she finally set breakfast down, I pushed the plate aside. "Thank you, but I'm not hungry." Caroline's smile tightened. "You need strength. You don't want people to worry." I wanted to say, "people" or "you." but I swallowed the words. Grief teaches you silence as much as it teaches you sorrow. Later, while she flitted around the living room, I noticed Edward's photo. The one from our 40th anniversary was no longer on the mantle. In its place, Caroline had arranged a bouquet of lilies with a neat little card from Michael and Caroline. I opened my journal that night and wrote, "If kindness had fingerprints, hers would smudge. If silence were a shield, Michael was hiding behind it. And me, I may be grieving, but I am not blind." I slid the journal shut and placed it beside Edward's glasses, the two of them keeping watch for me. I started carrying my journal everywhere, slipping it into the deep pocket of my cardigan like a secret weapon. Every time Caroline dropped one of her sugared barbs, I wrote it down. Not because I thought anyone would read it, but because truth deserves ink, not memory. Memory bends, ink does not. Us. Caroline's pattern became clear, small humiliations, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. She'd correct me in front of neighbors. Claudia meant Thursday, not Wednesday. She'd take calls in my living room, speaking loudly enough for me to hear her words, estate property transition. Always those three. Michael remained quiet, nodding when she spoke, glancing at me with guilt that lasted half a heartbeat before sinking back into silence. One afternoon, Caroline sat across from me with her perfect smile. "Claudia, you really shouldn't stress about bills and accounts. Michael and I can handle all that. You just rest." Her paws lingered like a wolf sniffing the air. I smiled thinly and lifted my pen, jotting her words down in the journal as I spoke them aloud. "Michael and I can handle all that." Her eyes flickered just for a second. She knew I was keeping record. Odd fact of the day: medieval monks copied manuscripts, not just to preserve scripture, but to anchor truth against time. Every stroke of ink was both devotion and defense. That night, I flipped back through earlier entries, the lilies replacing Edward's photo, the misplaced mugs, the reset comment at the funeral. Alone, they were irritations. Together, they formed a pattern sharp enough to cut. Humor kept me afloat. If politeness were a sport, Caroline would cheat at it. If Michael's silence were gold, he'd be a wealthy man. And me, I'm grieving, yes, but I'm also documenting. The journal grew heavy in my hand, but heavier still was the truth settling into my chest. A week later, the doorbell rang just after breakfast. On the porch stood a man in a gray suit with a leather briefcase. "Mrs. Bennett," he asked, his voice steady but kind. "I'm Charles Whitman, your late husband's attorney. May I come in?" I led him to the dining room where sunlight streaked the table Edward and I had polished together for decades. Michael and Caroline arrived minutes later, summoned by a text they claimed was urgent. Caroline's lipstick gleamed as though she were preparing for a photo shoot rather than a legal meeting. Mr. Whitman opened his briefcase and laid out papers in neat stacks. "Your husband left a final provision in his will. It was sealed until now." Caroline leaned forward, eyes bright. Michael sat stiffly, hands clasped. I folded mine in my lap, bracing. Whitman read aloud, "I, Edward Bennett, leave our home and its assets to my wife, Claudia Bennett, in full. It is my wish that she live free from interference and that no third party may lay claim without her consent." The room stilled. Caroline's face drained of color, then flushed dark. "That can't be right. Michael is the son. Surely the estate is protected by Mr. Bennett's explicit language," Whitman interrupted gently. "This clause overrides general inheritance distribution. Claudia is sole owner." This odd fact of the day: in contract law, the word shall carries absolute force. Not may, not might, shall. Edward had written, "shall remain in Claudia's control." Michael rubbed his temples, caught between loyalty and the fury brewing beside him. Caroline, lips tight, muttered, "Of course. We only want what's best for you, Claudia." I smiled, small but sharp. Edward already decided what was best. That night in my journal, I wrote, "If silence were armor today, Edward lent me his. If greed were glass, I just heard it crack. And me, I'm still standing where Edward meant me to." I slid the papers into my safe. Edward's voice, firm on the page, felt like a hand steadying mine. Caroline's behavior changed after the will reading, but not in the way you might hope. She became sweeter, sickly sweet, the kind that coats your tongue and makes you gag. She arrived with grocery bags, rearranged my shelves, and chirped, "You shouldn't have to lift a finger, Claudia." But her eyes told another story. They scanned every drawer she opened, every envelope on the counter, every key ring. Her smile was the kind gamblers wear when bluffing. Michael trailed behind her, quieter than ever, his guilt pressing down like fog. He rarely spoke to me directly anymore, as though acknowledging me might worsen the tension. One evening, Caroline sat across from me at the kitchen table, resting her manicured hands atop mine. "Claudia, paperwork is such a burden. Why don't you let me help with the house bills? You can focus on yourself." I pulled my hands away, slowly jotting her words into my journal as I repeated them. "Help with the house bills." Her smile twitched, brittle as glass. Odd fact of the day, the word mask comes from an Arabic root meaning to falsify. People wore masks in ancient theaters to exaggerate expression. Some masks, though, never come off. Later that night, I checked my files. An insurance statement had gone missing, one I knew I'd left on the counter. I found it days later, tucked beneath magazines in the guest room, Caroline's handwriting faintly penciled in the margins, little notes about coverage limits. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I made copies of everything and tucked the originals into a safe deposit box. I gave Patricia, my neighbor and friend, a sealed envelope in case anything happens. In my journal, I scribbled, "If kindness had calories, I'd be overfed. If theft wore perfume, it would smell like lilies. And me, I'm patient, but patience is not surrender." The house felt different now, no longer just a home, but a stage where masks and truth collided. The more I watched, the more the seams showed. Caroline thought she was careful, but even the best liars leave crumbs. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the guest room, I heard her voice through the cracked window. She was on the phone outside, pacing near the garden. "Yes, I told you the accounts are locked up tight. But once she slips, it'll be ours. I just need Michael to keep quiet." A pause, then sharper. "No, she won't last forever. Stress does things." Her words slithered into me like ice water. I crept back to my journal, writing fast so I wouldn't forget. Later, when I checked the mailbox, I noticed 2 envelopes missing from a stack, both bank correspondence. I called the branch manager, who confirmed someone had tried to request account access under my name. The attempt failed, but the attempt was enough. Odd fact of the day, the word clue comes from clue, meaning a ball of thread. In old stories, a hero escaped a maze by following a clue of string. Every strange taste in my tea, every missing document, every overheard whisper together, they form my own clue leading straight to Caroline. Michael grew more withdrawn. I caught him staring at me once, almost speaking, then shaking his head. Silence had become his chosen language, a loyalty to her built on fear of breaking apart. That night, Patricia stopped by with soup. When I told her what I'd heard, her jaw clenched. "You need to be ready, Claudia. She's not waiting for grief to fade. She's accelerating it." I smiled grimly, tapping my journal. "I am ready. Every word she speaks is another knot in the rope she's tying for herself." In my notebook, I added, "If lies were breadcrumbs, she's left a whole bakery. If silence were complicity, Michael is fluent. And me, I'm walking the maze, thread in hand." The house creaked in the night, but this time I didn't flinch. The walls were listening with me. After weeks of watching and waiting, I knew what I had to do. Prepare not just to defend myself, but to strike back if necessary. I visited the bank quietly, transferring key accounts into separate institutions, each requiring my presence for any changes. I rented a safe deposit box and placed copies of Edward's will, my property deeds, and every suspicious note I'd logged there. Patricia accompanied me, once joking, "You look like you're running a spy operation." "Better safe than silent," I replied. At home, I bought a small, fireproof safe for the bedroom. Inside it, I stored the most sensitive documents and a flash drive of digital scans. My journal, though, never left my side. It felt less like a diary and more like a shield carved from paper and ink. Caroline noticed my new composure. "You seem different, Claudia," she said one afternoon, eyes narrowing. "I suppose grief teaches you things," I answered, stirring my tea deliberately without drinking it. Her smile wavered. Odd fact of the day, the word fortress shares its root with fortitude. A fortress isn't just a structure, it's the embodiment of endurance. My house was still mine, but more importantly, my spirit had become a fortress too. Patricia and I developed small signals. If Caroline pressed too close, Patricia would drop by unannounced. If I felt unsafe, I'd leave the porch light on during the day. Quiet defenses, subtle but steady. One evening, Caroline placed her hand on my shoulder, squeezing just a little too firmly. "We're only trying to make life easier for you." I smiled back, steady as steel. "Funny you make it sound harder." That night, my notebook bore 3 truths. If patience were bricks, I've built walls. If vigilance were oxygen, I'm breathing deep. And me, I'm no longer prey, I'm prepared. I slept soundly for the first time in months, knowing the fortress was holding. It all came to a head in the kitchen as I suspected it would. Kitchens reveal people how they stir, how they slice, how they speak when the walls are close and the stove hums between words. Caroline stood at the counter one evening unpacking groceries she had picked up for me. I watched her slide a container of stew into the fridge, the lid labeled in her neat handwriting. "Claudia, you can't live like this forever," she said casually, as though commenting on the weather. "Bills, upkeep, decisions. It's a lot for someone in your situation. Why not let us manage things?" Her voice was honey, but her eyes glittered like broken glass. Michael hovered in the doorway, shoulders tense, gaze fixed on the tiles. I realized then that his silence wasn't just complicity, it was fear. He'd chosen the quietest way to survive. I placed my tea on the counter and faced her squarely. "I've managed for 67 years, Caroline. I don't see why I'd stop now." The mask slipped. Her jaw tightened. Her hand gripped the counter too hard. "You're being difficult. We're offering help." "Help." I repeated, pulling my journal from my cardigan pocket. I opened to a fresh page and wrote her words down, speaking them aloud as my pen moved. "You're being difficult." Her face drained. For once, the silence belonged to her. Odd fact of the day, in Japanese sword making, the blade is folded over and over, not to weaken but to strengthen. "Conflict too can fold you sharper if you let it," Michael muttered Caroline. But his voice was a thread too thin to hold. I set down my pen and closed the journal with a snap. This house is mine. This life is mine. And every word you speak digs the hole you're standing in. That night, I wrote 3 lines that steadied me. If kitchens are battlefields tonight, I won the first skirmish. If silence were armor, Michael's is cracked. And me, I may bend, but I will not break. The stew went untouched. The journal, heavier than ever, felt like a blade. After that kitchen clash, Caroline pulled back, at least on the surface. She spoke softer, smiled wider, and called me dear with syrup in her tone. But I knew better. Sweetness that's sudden is just a new disguise. Patricia noticed too. "She's not finished," she warned me. "She's regrouping." So I took the next step. I visited Charles Whitman, the attorney, carrying my journal and a folder of copied documents. He listened, brows knitting, as I read aloud the entries, dates, words, even the missing insurance statement with Caroline's notes scrawled in the margins. When I finished, he tapped the desk slowly. "You've built a stronger case than most detectives," he said. "If she makes another move, we'll be ready to act formally." Odd fact of the day, the word evidence comes from the Latin videre, to see. And once you see something, you can't unsee it. Back at home, Caroline hovered more than ever. She asked pointed questions about my health, offered to organize medications, even suggested installing a family account for easier bill payments. I nodded politely, each suggestion sliding into my notebook like ammunition. Michael's silence began to fray. One night I caught him standing in the hallway, watching me tuck the journal into my safe. His eyes brimmed with words he couldn't speak. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, retreating to his room. Patricia and I began rehearsing contingencies. If she pushes guardianship, we'll counter with your documentation. If she forges again, Whitman will take it straight to the court. It felt surreal strategizing against my own daughter-in-law. Yet I felt steadier with every plan. That night I wrote, if masks were armor, hers is dented. If silence were a wall, Michael's is cracking. And me, I'm not waiting for rescue, I'm preparing for victory. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt watchful, as if even its beams were leaning in to witness the truth. It happened on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day where the clouds seemed to crouch low over the house. Caroline arrived with her usual brightness umbrella dripping in the entryway and a casserole dish clutched in her hands. Claudia, I made your favorite, she chirped, setting it on the counter. Comfort food for a gloomy day. Her eyes flicked to the papers spread neatly across my dining room table. Utility bills, a bank statement, the latest insurance notice. All deliberately arranged bait. I smiled politely. How thoughtful. I let the steam from the casserole fog my glasses before pushing it aside. Why don't we sit and review these bills first? She hesitated, then sat, sliding closer than necessary. You don't need to worry about all this. Michael and I can simplify everything. Just sign a few forms and it'll all be easier. Her hand slipped a document from her bag, nudging it toward me. I recognized the clumsy forgery of my signature at the bottom. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I clicked the small recorder hidden beneath the table. That's interesting, Caroline. You've been busy. Her face blanched, then darkened. You're imagining things, she snapped. Right then, the back door opened. Patricia entered with Charles Whitman behind her, two officers close on their heels. The kitchen filled with the sound of authority shoes on tile, voices clipped and steady. Caroline leapt to her feet. This is harassment. She's twisting everything. But Charles laid the forged form flat next to my journal. On the contrary, he said, this is clarity. Odd fact of the day in chess checkmate doesn't mean the king is captured. It means there is nowhere left to move. Caroline's face collapsed as the officers read her rights. Michael, pale as the rain, could only watch as his wife's mask shattered. That night I wrote, if casseroles had intentions, this one was criminal. If truth had a sound, it's a gavel striking. And me? I've waited long enough. The waiting is over. The house was silent after they left, the kind of silence that doesn't press on your chest, but lets you breathe. Caroline was taken into custody, the forged papers and recordings packed carefully into evidence bags. Patricia hugged me at the doorway, her grip steady, her words firm. It's over now, Claudia. She can't touch you. But endings are never that simple. Michael returned 2 days later, his eyes hollow, his shirt wrinkled as though he'd slept in it. He stood in the living room, hands in his pockets, staring at Edward's old armchair. I should have stopped her, he whispered. I wanted to tell him yes, he should have. I wanted to rage about his silence the way it nearly drowned me. But grief softened my anger. Instead, I said, you chose quiet, Michael. Now you have to choose what comes next. He nodded, tears rimmed in red. I'll testify. It's the least I can do. Odd fact of the day, the word confession comes from Latin to declare openly. Silence is heavy, but confession is heavier still because it demands lifting the weight in public. Caroline's charges grew fraud, attempted coercion, misappropriation. With the evidence stacked high, her plea crumbled. She accepted a deal, probation, and public shame. The mask she had worn so carefully now lived only in the whispers of neighbors and the ink of court records. I sat at my kitchen table that night, the same table where she'd once tried to poison my peace, and finally felt the wood beneath my hand steady, not foreign. In my notebook, I wrote, if guilt were a garment, Michael is learning to wear it honestly. If justice were a candle tonight, it burns clean. And me, I'm not waiting for freedom. It's already here. The walls of the house felt lighter, as though even the beams were relieved. Summer arrived with a softness I hadn't felt in years. Sunlight stretched long across the yard, bees buzzed lazily in the lavender, and the house finally felt like it belonged to me again. Not a fortress, not a battlefield, just a home. Caroline's name became something spoken in lowered tones around town, a cautionary tale of greed dressed as kindness. Michael visited more often, subdued but earnest. He carried groceries, fixed the loose shutter Edward had meant to repair, and sometimes just sat with me in silence. That silence no longer felt like neglect. It was penitence. Patricia remained my anchor. Together, we joined a book club at the library where debates over plot twists were more fiery than any courtroom testimony. We gardened side by side, hands in the dirt, laughter spilling over like water. Odd fact of the day, the word resilience comes from the Latin resiliere, meaning to leap back. But resilience, I've learned, isn't about leaping into what was. It's about building something new, stronger, steadier, more your own. I started painting again, terrible little landscapes with crooked trees and skies too blue. I traveled with Patricia to the coast, letting the sea wind whip through hair that had grown thin but not weak. I even tried Tai Chi in the park, moving slowly, deliberately, learning how to inhabit my body without fear. The yellow journal, once my shield, now rests on the shelf beside Edward's watch and glasses. Its pages are full heavy with survival. I no longer need to add to it. On the anniversary of Edward's passing, I lit a single candle on the table. Instead of weeping, I whispered, "I'm safe, love. You'd be proud." The flame danced in agreement. That night I wrote my last 3 truths. If peace were soil, mine is fertile. If freedom were a song, I finally know the tune. And me, I am not surviving anymore. I am sovereign. The house exhaled with me, steady and whole. For the first time in a long while, I didn't just belong here, I thrived here. Claudia Bennett, 67, loses her husband Edward and faces not only grief, but subtle betrayal from her daughter-in-law Caroline. While her son Michael remains silent, Caroline grows bolder, rearranging Claudia's home, interfering with her finances, and disguising ambition as kindness. At first, Claudia doubts herself. But with a journal as her weapon, she begins documenting every slight, every missing document, every overheard whisper. The truth surfaces when Edward's will is revealed. Claudia is sole heir, protected by his explicit words. Enraged Caroline escalates, attempting fraud and manipulation. Claudia prepares carefully, safeguarding documents, copying evidence, and enlisting her neighbor, Patricia, and lawyer Charles Whitman. Caroline presses harder, presenting forged paperwork and tainted food. In a final confrontation in Claudia's kitchen, Caroline's schemes collapse under the weight of Claudia's documentation, hidden cameras, and witnesses. She is arrested, her mask shattered. The aftermath leaves Michael ashamed for his silence, but determined to testify. Caroline pleads to lesser charges, facing probation and public disgrace. Claudia, though wounded by betrayal, reclaims her home and her life. In the months that follow, she embraces freedom. With Patricia, she builds new routines, book clubs, gardening travel. She paints, she breathes, she laughs again. Her journal, once a lifeline of survival, becomes a relic of resilience. On Edward's anniversary, Claudia lights a candle, not in despair, but in peace. She reflects that resilience isn't about returning to who she was, but about becoming someone stronger, sovereign over her own story. The betrayal that once threatened to erase her instead carved space for a new season, one of freedom, peace, and quiet triumph.